everyone. My name is Maria Thomas, and I work for Allianz Research, the global team of economists, strategists, sector advisors, and foresight experts of the Allianz Group, led by Ludovic Subran. Welcome to Tomorrow, a podcast where we'll be talking about our latest analyses of economic and capital market developments, as well as our views on trends affecting risk management. Let's get started. For the 2023 edition of the Allianz Trade Global Survey, we decided to check the pulse of nearly 3,000 companies in 7 countries. In this episode, we dive into the results with Anna Boata, Head of Economic Research at Allianz Trade, and Anu Kuanand, Head of Corporate Research. Hello, Anna and Anu. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Maria.
Hi, Maria. Thanks for having us.
So for this year's edition of the Allianz Trade Global Survey, you asked nearly 3,000 companies in 7 countries about their expectations for global trade in 2023. Can you tell us what were the most striking results?
Yeah, sure. I think it's all about testing the resilience, right? Probably a bit of high pessimism since the energy crisis last autumn. And we actually see that companies show some resilience. And we actually see quite a high share of exporters that expect an increase in their turnover in 2023. We do talk about 70% of them. It's lower than last year when it was above 80%, but it's still quite a nice number. And actually, when we look into what does it mean in terms of the value of that export increase, we understand that indeed companies are heading towards a new normal in terms of volume and price effects. Why do I say that? It's because half of them expect turnover growth between 2 and 5% in 2023. So clearly that's 3 times less than what it used to be over the past 2 years. And we do also have between 15 and 20% of companies that expect a decrease in turnover growth, and some of them even a strong one above 10%. But that's clearly a low minority. Now, of course, countries where the energy crisis was much stronger are also the ones to be the least optimistic, like Germany, like Italy, like the UK. And we also see that because we live in a world where interest rates are higher, financing constraints are stronger, we also see that the strategy when it comes to export has changed. And a lot of the exporters are intending to invest more on existing markets, 63%, rather than going out for new export markets, where we see that around 40% of them would encourage this strategy. And it's clearly even more striking if we look at the country differences, with the US being the less outgoing, if we can call it like that. Only 39% of US companies would invest in new markets. And that's, of course, not only the rise in political risk, protectionism, but also the overall low growth in global trade. If you think about our own forecasts, we barely see growth in volume in 2023, less than 1%, and clearly negative value effects after quite strong nominal effects over the past 2 years.
Now, in our insolvency report, we pointed out insolvency risks are on the rise. Do you find that companies are worried about this too?
Yes, absolutely. When we ask corporates about their expectations in terms of length of payments and also risk of non-payments, we are seeing that those are clearly on the rise. About 40% of corporates are expecting an increase in terms of non-payment risk. This share almost goes to 50% in countries like the US or even Germany. And so clearly there is a sense that risk of non-payment is back. And these numbers are quite higher than what we saw early 2022 before the war in Ukraine. So I would say that corporates are more and more concerned about the counterparty risk. And in an environment where at Allianz Trade, we're also expecting a pickup in global insolvency of about 20% in 23, we feel that it's a warranted feeling from corporates.
What are some of the other challenges that they highlighted?
So there were, of course, a number of risks that the exporters highlighted for this year's edition. And on top of them, transportation risk, transportation costs, political risk, but also financing risk. So clearly, the topic of supply chains come back in an environment where since the beginning of the year, we do see a normalization ongoing. When we think about the transportation cost, waiting times, we are almost back to pre-pandemic levels. But still, it is a risk that companies take more and more into consideration when planning. And actually, we were very curious to see what companies managed to implement after the COVID crisis in terms of reshoring, in terms of changing suppliers, and clearly mitigating risk and gaining more resilience in case of a future crisis. And I must admit, we were quite disappointed because we were expecting a larger share of companies to having operated such kind of important changes of their supply chains. Of course, they have all pursued significant works of identifying the suppliers and trying to understand where the risks lie, but only 25% of them really relocated production or changed suppliers in order to reduce the risks. And clearly that's striking because they were around 60% of them back in 2020 to claim that they would change their supply chains. Now, of course, if we think about the idea of relocation and the homecoming, it's interesting also to see that in the end, the public policy measures are making the difference. And in the end, if we look at those companies that are planning to implement even more relocation, we do talk about the US with 40% of them wanting to change to get back production at home, 30% in France, but only 25% in the UK or Italy. So clearly, the type of public policies that are implemented are making the difference to make the homecoming even more attractive. So clearly, I would say that as a bottom line, in the end, there's no deglobalization operating or not a strong one. And clearly, whenever we talk about relocation and shorter supply chains, actually is more talk than walk.
Are they also worried about rising interest rates?
Definitely, the rise of interest rate has been putting some pressure on corporates. And on top of that, considering the fact that in the US, but it's also true in the UK or Italy, we are seeing that firms' excess cash reserve are depleting. This is not surprising. Nevertheless, bank loans are still the second source of financing that is considered by the corporates that we surveyed. So they still rely on bank loans, but they feel that it's getting more expensive and it could pose a risk for financing their operations.
So what are they doing to cope?
So one of the key risks for corporates over the short run, but also in the longer run, is everything that is related to climate and ESG. So the first thing, and that's quite reassuring, is that more and more corporates are well aware about the risk, and the executive that we survey have a rather very good idea, or they know exactly what their corporates are doing. So over 80% of the executives that we surveyed know exactly or have a very good idea of how much their firm is investing to tackle ESG challenges. But so far, I would say the main coping mechanism has been to increase ESG compliance standards for their suppliers, or selecting their supplier based on harsher ESG compliance measure. I would say the mechanism to adjust their own practices and own processes is not yet at the top of the list. So far, firms are rather aiming for the low-hanging fruits in order to address this ESG risk.
And what do exporters wish for when it comes to government support?
Well, there's a good news, is that they are relying less on wide, let's say, state support after a couple of years of them being used to a lot of liquidity and tax measures. So that's interesting to see that corporates are becoming more realistic. But then, of course, they still want some financing support from governments in terms of export credit agencies, development banks, grants. So everything that could support their export development, especially in the riskier export markets. And then, very interestingly, what comes up on the wish list is clearly the upskilling or reskilling, and that's something new. Clearly, it comes in an environment where we have been operating into a tight labor market, and labor shortages still prevail. And clearly, that's one of the key actions of some of the European governments already ongoing and bearing fruit. But we have seen that across the board for the exporters in the sample that we surveyed. And then the third item on the wish list, of course, the lower regulation. But hey, you would not be surprised for that answer, I would expect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you so much for listening. You can find the full report we just spoke about on our website. We'll leave a link in the show notes. If you'd like to discover more of our research, you can also follow the Ludonomics newsletter on LinkedIn. We'll leave a link down below for that too. If you like the podcast, please send it to any of your friends who might like it too, and leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. In the meantime, stay tuned for the next episode.